Okay.
So, now I think the camera is rolling.
Yeah, now, are you all right as far as the glare on eyeglasses and everything?
It's okay.
Okay, we'll start again. The question here is, what are the lasting themes or monuments or achievements of the 60s? And I would say as follows: the interest in the nature of mind itself and the texture of consciousness, leading to interest in exploring psychedelic substances, magic mushrooms, and peyote and LSD, leading to ecological consciousness, or interest in the mind relating to the world, and that leading to ecological consciousness, which was introduced very early. Realization that the planet itself is threatened by destruction by the human virus, as if the planet itself has AIDS, with the immune system breaking down, and earth and air and fire and water all being tainted at this point, so that there is a serious danger that we have to face. And slowly people are beginning to understand that, even governments. Interest in Eastern thought, the meeting of East and West, which is implicitly political as well as cultural, but certainly eliminates a lot of cultural paranoia, in that in the past people thought that the East was inscrutable, and East is East and West is West, and never the twain shall meet. And now Eastern mind is open and available to any Westerner who's interested in seeing how empty it is. That's what it boils down to.
Allen Ginsberg et symbol på 4 tiårs opprør, 4 tiårs alternativ kultur i det amerikanske samfunn, og som har spredt seg til den vestlige verden, og etter hvert også Østen. Allerede på 40-tallet slo han seg sammen med Jack Kerouac og William Burroughs, og begynte å utforske poesien og seg selv. De fikk en interesse for Østens religioner. De fikk en interesse for økologi, for den tredje verden, og etter hvert også den politiske opposisjonen mot det amerikanske system. Allen Ginsberg har overlevd alle eksperimenter, all galskap, og han har endog tatt seg tid til å komme til Oslo. Allen Ginsberg, I would like to return to the beginning, to the 40s. What triggered your curiosity? What triggered your literary activities and your curiosity for Eastern philosophy?
Well, poetry is a family business. My father was a poet, and my brother is a poet. So I just assumed that I would write poetry from when I was 7 or 8 years old. And reading Edgar Allan Poe, I think, turned me on, as it turned on people, youngsters, around the age of puberty, all the way around the world, from Prague to Beijing. But but being gay, I fell in love with a young student who was going to Columbia University, and so I wanted to go there. And through that adventure, instead of going to a provincial college, I met Jack Kerouac when I was 17, and William Burroughs, and I saw that they were serious about writing. And Kerouac particularly saw his role as a writer as a sacred or sacramental occupation. So I took that as my model, or that idea was contagious and clear. So I would say about 1945, 46, I realized that that was what I wanted to do as a sort of a vocation.
You started from a group of individuals, but at some moment you must have started feeling like a group with a common purpose.
No, a group with common friendship. I think this notion of a common purpose is some ideological semantic problem by sociologists or journalists. But a young group of friends is a young group of friends, and whether it's a soccer club or people who go out and drink beer on Friday night, or people who like to write poetry together or read each other's work. So I think that sense of sacramental devotion to poetry certainly was common between me and Kerouac. And Kerouac was very strongly an influence on William Burroughs to get William Burroughs to write way back in 1945, 6, 47. Because Burroughs didn't think of himself as a writer. But we both admired Burroughs as a very intelligent and sort of a very intelligent man and a kind of mentor for us. So, who was perhaps too shy to commit himself, so to speak, to paper. So Kerouac encouraged him to write prose by collaborating with him with alternative chapters on a novel. And that was back in 45.
Your lives have taken different roads, the three of you. Could you already from the beginning see these differences?
Well, we were different from the beginning. What do you mean, taking different roads? We're not occupying the same body. What are we supposed to do? Merge and become one clone? Kerouac was a French-Canadian who lived with his family. I had left my family at 16 and gone to college. Burroughs was, they say, a remittance man from a not too well-to-do family who, to keep him out of trouble, were sending him $200 a month, which was a lot of money back in the 40s. And we continued our friendship all through this time. It hasn't diverged that much. Kerouac died, but Burroughs and I see each other or are in contact all the time. Well, I mean, every month or so. Along with a lot of other poets. From 1950 on, Gregory Corso, who was a great poetic genius, whom I see in New York all the time, and work with, sometimes give readings. And Peter Orlovsky, with whom I lived for many years, and Gary Snyder and Philip Whalen, and Michael McClure. It was, from 1955, a group of other friends having somewhat the same inclination. If I were to define if you're interested, I could try to define the common themes or common interests. Among the poets, a reliance on spontaneity, inventiveness, and open form, rather than a closed form which was being used by the academic poets of that day, and a tendency toward, let us say, individualistic experimentation with the nature of the mind, as distinct from the development out of T.S. Eliot, which was royalist in politics, Anglican in religion, conservative in temperament. Certainly Burroughs, who comes from T.S. Eliot's same hometown and has a very similar voice and background, is radically different as an experimental writer and as a experimental soul than Eliot. Though actually somewhat similar in dissociation of sensibility and structure of his work to Eliot of the Wasteland. So I think from the very beginning, at least 1945, Kerouac and I did talk about, well, I don't know what the meaning of it was, but a new vision or a new consciousness. And it might be maybe a new old consciousness, but certainly a different than a consciousness or awareness different from the social, political, sexual awareness of the all-rightniks of my college days, or the professors. So we were interested in the texture of consciousness, particularly Burroughs, and experimenting with that and exploring that, whether through psychotherapy or psychoanalysis or hypnoanalysis, which Burroughs was going through in 1945, or through art, or experiments at the time with marijuana, and for Burroughs with heroin or morphine, and for Kerouac some experiments with amphetamines, which didn't do him too much good physically. And from about 1950 on, particularly through Kerouac, an interest in Eastern thought, particularly Buddhism. And from 1955 on, direct interest in Zen and Buddhist meditation practice through Gary Snyder and Philip Whalen. And to this day, both Snyder and Whalen are meditative Buddhists, and Philip Whalen was one of the San Francisco Renaissance poets and a friend of Kerouac. At this point, Philip Whalen is the abbot of a Zen center in San Francisco. So it's our first, so to speak, beat or San Francisco Renaissance poet, Zen master. So there was an interest in the texture of mind, I would say spiritual liberation. And that led to liberation in literary forms, liberated open literary forms. And that led to vernacular, idiomatic diction and cadence influenced by African American speech and jazz in the poetry and in the prose. And that led to candor or frankness or openness in the subject matter that we wrote about. For Burroughs and for myself, homosexuality as one of the themes. And that led to liberation of the word. And that led to battle with the state over censorship. So that led to liberation of the word on a social level and liberation of books. And that was followed in the early 60s. The legal battles were between 1958 and 1962. You could say the spiritual liberation in the 40s liberated artworks or writing or poetry by 1950 to 1957. Legal battles for the against censorship, 1957 to 1962, and then maybe a spread of that liberation from censorship into film with the activities of Robert Frank and Jonas Mekas of the underground film archives and cooperatives, and Andy Warhol and Harry Smith and Stan Brakhage and others. Flaming Creatures by Jack Smith. So that by 1965, films were liberated, so you could have people naked in films and talk about sex. So, and I think the gay liberation and spiritual liberation may have been some of the catalysts to women's liberation and black liberation. I remembered Abby Hoffman, who was a social activist, leftist, saying that he had left Massachusetts, his hometown, and gone south in 1963 or so to help get the vote for black people in Alabama, going to Birmingham, carrying a copy of On the Road in his pocket. So, and a lot of successive generations have used Burroughs's methods of writing, liberating himself from obsession by using the cut-up method, liberating himself from the product of his own stereotypes, let us say, liberating himself from his own obsessions and stereotypes by using chance methods like John Cage in his writing, and that's had quite an effect on generations later in the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s up to U2. So there's the basic theme is the proposition of regaining our own senses, understanding our own minds, some meeting of Eastern thought with Western mind. And that also led with Gary Snyder and Michael McClure, another poet, and Kerouac to some extent, with the theme or preoccupation with ecological thinking, which Snyder introduced into poetry in America in 1955. So those, I would say, are the main themes which developed over the years. Plus an interest in spoken poetry because of the idiomatic nature of the poetry, or even poetry as song, since Kerouac derived a lot of his inspiration from African American cadences, rhythms, and speech patterns through bebop music of the 40s. And that led to an interest in jazz, of course, and led Kerouac to perform with music and myself to write music. And I think Kerouac's Mexico City Blues, according to Bob Dylan, was the very book that inspired him to poetry also. So there was a great deal of fallout from the openings and liberations that we stumbled on.
When you started exploring these fields back in the 40s, did you feel as working in a tradition of previous generations of rebels and free minds, or did you feel like a person discovering the world by himself?
Both, because I think when I first started smoking grass, for instance, or later took some peyote, some of the psychedelics, it was like exploring a new world. I think I was the only student at Columbia who smoked marijuana at the time in 1946. But I had heard that there was one up in Harvard, and that turned out to be Robert Creeley. And I met Robert Creeley about 1948, the first time. Though about 10 years later, we had a much closer literary relationship. But on the other hand, there was a very old tradition of Bohemian poets. I don't know about rebels. That's a more modern stereotype. But there was the old Bohemian tradition. Remember, Baudelaire experimented with hashish, as did Rimbaud. Havelock Ellis, another Englishman, experimented with, or William James, were familiar with nitrous oxide and what they call the anesthetic revelation from laughing gas. Havelock Ellis had explored peyote back in the 1890s. There was an old tradition in France, the Club des Échichines, well, going back all the way to Baudelaire, Delacroix, and the writers of, 1840, 1850, Théophile Gautier and others, who were familiar with laudanum. I think De Quincey and Coleridge took laudanum, which is a form of opium, and Burroughs has quoted De Quincey and Coleridge quite often on the subject. There are the old gay poems of Catullus, Sappho, even Homer, or Plato, up to Walt Whitman. So there's an old tradition of gay literature and sexual liberation that keeps getting suppressed, but I remember in 1945 reading translations of Catullus, and in the American editions, the more salacious or supposedly sexy passages were only printed in Latin. It was illegal to print them in English. Same for the Satyricon of Petronius Arbiter. The modern library edition had the homosexual passages printed in Latin in the regular standard New York edition from Random House's Modern Library. So there's an old tradition that way, going all the way back to the Bible, David and Jonathan. Much less the Gilgamesh epic, the love of Enkidu and Gilgamesh. So that's a very old tradition in terms of sexual candor or honesty or, I don't know, traditional gay behavior and sentiment and romance and literature. So both in sexual matters, in drugs, and in attitudes toward the state, toward the defense against the omnipresent big brother. There's an always of the state. There's a long history of resistance to oppression. So I think we were, as far as the expansive liberation sense, the sense of expansiveness and openness and friendliness and adhesiveness, that I think was a feature of our relation. That is an affection between men, Burroughs, Kerouac, myself, Corso, and others, working together. You do have many, many groups from old times, but up to the example of Walt Whitman and his exhortation that poets and artists of the future be comrades, and that affection and adhesiveness was the one quality that could make democracy work if the citizens really liked each other and felt, rather than were at each other's throats. So there's an older tradition that comes up in the 20th century through Ezra Pound of affection between writers, as he championed Robert Frost, William Carlos Williams, James Joyce, T.S. Eliot, helped get their work published. And directly into our own lives with William Carlos Williams, who Kerouac met and I met and wrote the preface to my first book and second book too, and who also encountered Gary Snyder and Philip Whalen and the poet Lou Welsh in 1952 in the northwest of America at Reed College in Portland, Oregon, on a national poetry reading tour that William Carlos Williams took. And his teaching was the opening up of the word and the opening up of the stanza, open form of poetry and spontaneous mind. Then later there is an older tradition that we tapped into from 1950 on to the 90s now, joining efforts with Tibetan Buddhist lamas and Zen masters, and their old practice of spontaneous mind, spontaneous discourse, spontaneous poetry is a tradition in Tibetan, Chinese, and Japanese discourse. The teacher I studied with was the Tibetan Lama Chogyam Trungpa. And I'd been interested in the Tibetan Book of the Dead and that kind of writing since the 50s. But finally met Trungpa briefly on a pilgrimage through India with Gary Snyder to go to Buddhist holy places, but really encountered locked eyebrows with him, so to speak, in early 70s, and he became my teacher. And he is of a lineage of what's called crazy wisdom, which is very similar to the beat humor or mode. That is the wild wisdom, not restricted by convention, unconventional wisdom, and based on discipline. But then once you've had the discipline, then you have to be spontaneous. So in that lineage, all the teachers have to be poets. And the great celebrated 10th century, 11th century poet is Milarepa, the cotton-clad illiterate guru of the Kagyu section, the Kagyu sect of Tibetan Buddhist meditation practice. So Trungpa is directly in that lineage, as were a number of teachers that I met later, who take as their inspiration Milarepa, who did what Kerouac did, simply spoke into the air, composed on the tongue. People wrote it down and didn't revise, as Kerouac practiced. I remember in '72 meeting Chogyam Trungpa, saying that I was a little tired of going around giving poetry readings. He said, "Oh, that's probably because you don't like your poetry." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, why don't you do like the ancient poets, the great poets of old, like Milarepa? Why do you need a piece of paper? Why don't you just get up on stage and make it up?" And that's exactly what Kerouac used to say. So the summary slogan for all that is that the Trungpa pronounced and that Kerouac practiced is first thought, best thought. And on that basis, we founded 20 years ago the Naropa Institute in Boulder, Colorado, and under that, the Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poetics. Disembodied because Kerouac was by then dead, but we wanted to do something to join Eastern thought and Western thought, Western Bohemian thought and Eastern crazy wisdom together. And the common basis is spontaneous mind, i.e., the characteristics of that would be, according to like the Shambhala teachings of Trungpa, meekness, because actually you don't know what you're doing, perkiness, or sparkiness, or liveliness, because it's all coming on the spot at the moment, inscrutability, because you don't know what you're going to think next or say next, so nobody can figure it out in advance, including yourself. And outrageousness, because the mind itself goes beyond all bounds in its imaginations.
Returning to the early days of the Beat generation, how did you react to this term? I guess when it started spreading in the press or with the publishers and the audience. Did you
Well, that's a later time, not earlier. See, the period of gestation that I was talking about was 1944, 45, 46 to 48. The term beat came into circulation maybe 8, 9 years later in a minor level as a sort of literary term, but didn't take public foothold till 1958, 59, so that's 10 years, or 15 years after we'd all met. So we'd already sort of for a firm foundation, created some sort of a foundation in actual writing. By the time the Beat generation was a media stereotype, Kerouac had already written 15, 16 books, which then could retrospectively be labeled and stereotyped as Beat, but they weren't written under any Beat rubric. And I had finished several books of poetry, which retrospectively were called Beat. And Burroughs finished Junkie, Queer, Yahe Letters, and most of Naked Lunch before the term began to be applied. So actually, it was more or less of a publicist media stereotype with which to label people and reduce them from a fresh view that they might present and box it up and put a wrapping around it so it could make a sound bite. So the question then was whether to resist and waste time on other people's bad poetry, or honor the term by continuing to create work that was worthy of being called Beat.
I think there, at least on the surface, are differences between what you did and Burroughs and Kirk.
Oh yeah, totally different. We're all different.
See, especially in Burroughs' writing, element of self-destructiveness.
Well, I don't know. But remember, before you go any further, remember, Burroughs is now 80 years old. So you might watch what you're saying in that way. I hope I live to be 80.
And even in kind of on the road, there is an element of desperation, of desperately living a life almost to
I think that's a. I really don't agree that there's an element of desperation in On the Road. I think there's a joyousness and an enthusiasm, but the desperation, I think, is. Everybody's desperate at one time or another, particularly if you have a fight with your wife or your girlfriend, or run out of money. But I don't think immortal desperation is there. No. I think it's more a question of energy and joyousness and exuberance. On the road. I think it's misread as desperation. But maybe you could point out a passage which seems desperate. I would say exuberant. And there's a big difference between exuberance and desperation. I would say that maybe neoconservatives would like to say that exuberance is desperation. But I would say that certain kinds of quietism and fear of activity and openness are characteristic of desperation. In fact, I think Thoreau said most men lead lives of quiet desperation.
There is definitely in the beat literature a strong lust for life.
Yeah. But even that, I think it's more inquisitiveness rather than lust. Inquisitiveness and enthusiasm. Lust is again this obsessive, desperate thing you're laying out. Lust for Life actually is the title of a book by Irving Stone on the suicide Van Gogh. So do we have to constantly be using stereotypes from one genre onto another is my question. And I, as a poet who has to invent things and make it new and stay fresh and try to keep things straight, I find myself constantly sort of like at a sword's point with media and trying to clarify the language and use a language of poetry rather than a language of older stereotypes. And I would say Lust for Life is one. It's the title of a book by Irving Stone 30 years ago about Van Gogh.
In the 60s, there was a mass movement in the United States of anti-war activities, of countercultural activities. Did you see this as a continuation of or a mass spreading to a lot of people, or what you in small groups have been doing for 20 years?
Some aspects of it, the anti-war pacifism. Though Kerouac thought that mass movements of that kind tended toward fascism or stupidity or repetitious sentimentality, although he was against the war himself, the Vietnam War. The experiments with psychedelics and marijuana, I think, were, of course, in the same line, but then we were in a lineage going all the way back to Baudelaire and Rimbaud, as I said. But it seemed to me that we had a hand in encouraging people to go beyond the real death drugs, which are tobacco and alcohol, and trying to find alternatives that had some information or subtlety in relation to the texture of the mind, that were educational. The excessive use of acid, like dropping acid 100 times in high school or at parties, was not our program. I used to get high on peyote or acid or whatever, or grass, and go to the Museum of Modern Art and look at Cézanne's watercolors. The development into rock and roll from music apparently is an outgrowth of our own interest in poetry and music. As Dylan says, he was inspired by Kerouac's book of poems, Mexico City Blues. We were at Kerouac's grave, filming Ronaldo and Clara, and I asked Dylan what he knew about Kerouac's Mexico City Blues, because he opened up the book and began reading from it over Kerouac's gravestone. And he said, he knew it really well. That was the first book of poetry that really spoke to him. Somebody had handed him a copy in St. Paul, or 1958 or 59. And I said, why did it strike you? And he said, well, it was the first book that talked to me in my own language, first poetry. So he always ascribed his inspiration to Kerouac. So I think that aspect of the poetry of rock and roll, the examination of texts and people getting really interpreting the texts of the Beatles or Dylan or later, is a natural outgrowth of our own interests. The tradition of going to India or learning meditation or Eastern thought, I think, was very much inspired by Kerouac's Dharma Bums of 1957. And in sort of standard histories of the growth of Buddhism in America, Gary Snyder and Kerouac, and even myself and Philip Whalen, are held up as precursors or innovators and encouragers of the importation of Buddhist ideas and the acclimatization to American style. So those aspects, yes. The political extremism of the Students for Democratic Society, Red Brigade, the violence aspect, I think was quite alien to Kerouac's lamb-like temperament, and something that horrified him. Because I think he realized very early that any gesture taken in paranoia creates more paranoia. Any gesture taken in anger, like, quote, rising up angry, unquote, creates more anger, and spreads anger. Any gesture taken in resentment creates more resentment. Any gesture taken in peacefulness creates more peacefulness. Any gesture taken in equanimity creates lucidity and equanimity.
There was a demonstration in Oslo a few days ago against a racist politician from Denmark who was here on a nationalist conference. And these people who came more or less from maybe a punk background, they were spitting on him, and this was filmed and shown on TV. They were spitting in this old man's face, and there's been a big controversy, especially on the left in Norway, about these kinds of...
Any gesture of spitting creates more spitting. Of course, the racist problem is associated with, as it's been all along since the 40s and 50s, racism associated with police state, associated with secret police, associated with ethnic cleansing, associated with hypocritical Christianity, associated with Christian or Muslim fundamentalism, associated with ideological fundamentalism like Maoist Han people's racist superiority over Tibetans, or Russian racist superiority over Jews, or Nazi racist superiority over gypsies and homosexuals and Jews. So there's this resurgence of murderous nationalism all over Europe that has resulted in holocausts and ethnic cleansings now in Serbia and elsewhere, or in Bosnia, all over Russia and in Asia. So it is a big problem, that violence. And for young punks to react with violence is understandable, but it's sure the wrong way of dealing with it. So what I would recommend for young Mohawk punks is to learn basic Buddhist meditation practice. And out of that will rise much more effective ways of protest, remembering that the word protest means pro, in favor of, test, attestation, or witnessing. You've got to witness in favor of what you want rather than attack, just attack what is negative.
But is there a fine line between justified anger and aggression?
I don't think there's much of a fine line between justified anger and aggression, no. I think our job really is to examine our own anger and examine our own aggression. Very simple way of doing it that Kerouac described in the phrase, anger doesn't like to be reminded of fits. I'm sure those kids don't like to see themselves spitting on television, or else they won't in 5 years once they cool their heads and realize that they're doing damage to their own cause. But to deal with anger, the interesting thing is you don't have to stop your anger. You don't have to denounce your anger or push it away. All you have to do is notice it. The trick is noticing when you're angry, or detecting it as it rises, as it flowers, and as it declines. Enduring the embarrassment of noticing your fit of anger. Because once you notice anger, it tends to dissolve. once you're clear about what anger is, which is, anger is basically just a lot of chemical boiling over and adrenaline that confuses the issue. Like in martial arts, in the Oriental martial arts, the person who gets angry becomes blind. He doesn't see where he's hitting. He becomes off balance. The person who wins the battle is the one who is calm and centered and observes what's going on around him and simply moves to the left when a rush of anger comes by.
According to the authorities, marijuana and psychedelic drugs will change your personality permanently.
Well,
my experience is the opposite, that people who take these drugs will experience change, which they may appreciate, but when the effect fades away, they will return to their old self. Would you recommend, for example, meditation as a way of changing your mind permanently?
well, this is several different subjects here you're talking. On the subject, I think that marijuana and LSD does make a subtle change in personality, as any deep experience does, including meditation or winning in business or getting married or being successful in inventing a new chemical. Certainly any experience that's deep will change your personality slightly, generally for the better if it's a good deep experience. So it depends what you mean by change your personality. It sounds like a very vague threat in this case. But the real change of personality comes with illegal drugs. If anybody knows an alcoholic, there are quite great changes of personality that take place with alcoholism, particularly overnight or within 5 minutes between sobriety and drunkenness. The real dangerous drugs, in America at least, and I'm sure you have parallel statistics here in Norway, are, according to the New York Times surveys, 20 to 30,000 people a year die of illegal, illicit drugs, generally speed and heroin. Poison speed or unreliable heroin is on the street because junkies are just trying to score any way they can, being cut off from treatment by doctors. So that's 20 to 30,000 deaths from illicit drugs. 100,000 people a year in America die from alcohol. It's something like 4 or 5 times that number. And 430,000 people a year die from the bad effects of smoking tobacco. Cancer, heart failure, high blood pressure, and all the ills that go with tobacco smoke. So those are the real dangerous drugs. The officially sanctioned drugs. And the amusing thing is that marijuana, which doesn't kill anyone, is prosecuted in America with raving dogs and helicopters. And tobacco agriculture is subsidized by the government. And that tobacco, one interesting further footnote is that tobacco agriculture and tobacco interests and beer interests also fund a lot of conservative, neoconservative, right-wing, moralistic censorship groups who set themselves up as ethical counselors, maybe to compensate for their feeling of guilt of being mass murderers and purveying coffin nails and death-dealing drugs legally. For meditation, I think that meditation is a more ample and reliable way of altering consciousness and expanding consciousness in a very simple way of making yourself more aware of what's going on around you in your mind and outside of your mind, in the room, by sharpening your perceptions. In some respects similar to grass and acid, but more subtle and long range. So later thought, I think by the 70s I began thinking, probably if people are going to experiment with stronger things like LSD, it would be good to have a basis and a centering practice in meditation of some sort, some non-theistic, i.e. no God necessary, non-theistic awareness practice that involves centering yourself on the breath or whatever, so that you have a stable grounding as you try LSD. I don't think grass or marijuana poses any particular problem, except for people who are already inclined to be very neurotic and neurasthenic and tend to smoke a lot and get hung up in that. You know, it's sort of like leading that particular life of just smoking a lot and doing very little. But those people might be better off doing that than drinking, because that would really change their personality and make them violent.
Having explored many ways of searching the mind, expanding the mind, why did you choose Zen Buddhist meditation as your practice?
Oh, I didn't. I chose a Tibetan style. Well, only because I met a teacher whom I liked, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. Rinpoche means, it's a title like the Venerable Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, a Tibetan Lama whom I had met briefly in passing in India, but encountered in New York, and who was a poet and a calligrapher and an artist as well as a meditation master. And I liked his form of meditation. It seemed extremely simple and clear and almost inevitable. Basically, the key is for meditating is you sit up straight, spine straight, and in Tibetan style with your hands on your lap, as the older centuries illustrate, the paintings in tankas, the certain teachers are just sitting like this, hands at rest, and pay attention to the breath leaving your nostril, the out breath, from the tip of the nostril till the breath dissolves. Then on the in breath, you don't have to do anything. Just make sure that your spine is straight, that you're awake, sitting in a posture of awake. And on the next out breath, follow the out breath out. That sort of like unites the automatic breathing system with the conscious awareness of the breathing that's going on anyway. So you're not adding anything in except your awareness. And then you might find that you become impatient and the mind tends to wander and daydream and think and retrospect and memory and plan and question. So when you notice your mind wandering, just as I was before describing, noticing rising of anger, if you notice your mind wandering, that tends to dissolve the thought and you can bring your attention back to your next out-breath. So it's a question of balancing between the breath and awareness of your mind's activities, and then always coming back to the breath. And following the out-breath tends to lead your mind, it's like mixing the breath with space, as Trungpa described it once. Mixing the breath with space, mixing your mind with your breath, mixing your mind with space. And I think if you get high on marijuana, you find you're mixing your mind with space also. But this is a much more homegrown way of doing that. And very simple. Doesn't cost anything. So that's Tibetan style meditation. But I probably was attracted to Trungpa and his teaching because of his basic intelligence and humor, and the fact that he really loved Kerouac's poetry. So at the Naropa Institute, he approved our calling our school of poetry the Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poetics, because it also changed Trungpa's style of writing. He began experimenting in that international open form idiomatic instead of a classical seven-syllable Chinese Tibetan style.
At the Chicago demonstrations in '68, you were leading the crowd in an chanting. Yeah. What was the purpose of this chanting?
To provide a little area of calm and clarity amid the possible hysteria of police attacks and angry yippies trying to provoke the police. To provide some place and a medium and a method for people to be at rest and not be provocative, but just register their presence there in a quiet way. So I think Om was maybe the wrong mantra. If I were, a few years later in 72, I was talking to Trungpa, and he suggested using Ah. So we used Ah in 1972 in Miami with the presidential conventions. Ah being more American, like Ah. At the same time, appreciation of space, open, breath going out. So it's a measure of the out-breath. And at the same time, it's recognizable. It's not sort of an oriental closed Om, where you close back into yourself. So it isn't, is less mysterious and provocative than Om.
This situation in Chicago in '68 seems to me to be a unique meeting between the political activities, the political anger at the Vietnam War, and the countercultural search for a spiritual understanding.
Well, unfortunately, I think the political neo-Marxist anger tended to take over because it was more aggressive. And I think that was an enormous mistake that prolonged the Vietnam War. So that I think the extreme left has as much blood on its hands for the continuation of the Vietnam War until 1974 or so as maybe not as much blood, but it's a good deal of blood just as the right wing. Because the effect of all that was to disgrace the Democratic Party and to defeat Humphrey, because the left opted out not to vote. The political left didn't vote for Humphrey, and they voted for Nixon, whose intention was to end the war by bombing North Vietnam with an atom bomb. And maybe it was only the demonstrations in the streets that prevented that, but in any case, the left was too spiteful there. Their idea was to bring the war home, which was an enormous mistake because it scared the middle class, to wave Viet Cong flags, which was also a tactical mistake, to wave Viet Cong flags, which was also a tactical mistake. They were angry at their parents. And Kerouac put his finger on it and was accused of being a reactionary for criticizing those tactics when he said, those people are looking for new reasons for spitefulness. The result was that Humphrey didn't get in, and he was trying to force the Viet Cong to force the President Thieu, our ally, so-called ally, to allow the Viet Cong at the conference table for a peace talk. And Nixon and his people resisted that and had the idea that they would win the war by force. And so when Nixon got in, on only 500,000 votes, when the entire left refused to vote, several million people, Nixon escalated the war beyond anything that had gone before under Johnson or Kennedy, and it became a Holocaust. And I think the anger of the left was responsible for the prolongation of the war, because the Gallup poll said by February 1968, 52% of the American people thought the war had always been a mistake. So the left failed to lead the middle class out of the war because of their anger at the middle class, because they were angry. And that anger prolonged the war. And that's my definitive retrospect on it. So I don't think it was a very glorious occasion of the meeting of the spiritual beat, Heritage, and the Students for Democratic Society and neo-Marxist left. And by now, that neo-Marxist left is completely bankrupt with the collapse of their former idols. Remember, in those days they were carrying pictures of Castro around, who was a dictator, who'd kicked me out 3 years ago, before that, in 1965, out of Cuba. Or pictures of Mao Zedong, who was the most hated man in China by then for the Cultural Revolution that killed or exiled all the intellectuals and anybody that could read French or English or wore a pair of glasses. It was called a bourgeois stinker. So the heroes that the left were cultivating themselves were fraudulent, and it was all, I think, on the basis of this self-righteous anger.
Seems that the anarchist tradition is the only utopian model left.
Well, I don't know what anarchist, it depends how you define anarchism, but there is certainly the principle of decentralization is important. Decentralization from hierarchical control, power control. I like Buddhism because there's no God, so there's no central reference point. There's no hierarchy in that sense. There may be hierarchy of gurus, people who are aware that there's no God, but there isn't a hierarchy of deriving from a divine principle, and there certainly is not much of a hierarchy derived from ideology. There are other less dangerous hierarchies involved in Buddhism, the teachers, actually. But Carol Snyder has always been interested in Buddhist anarchism from that point of view. But, you know, anarchy is more and more difficult in the sense that we're already living in a highly centralized technological, hyper-technological, hyper-scientific society in which there are these information networks that are not anarchist but are completely controlled by the government or can be controlled. And to the extent that it's a monolith, anarchy becomes more and more difficult, although there's also these computer pioneers who say, no, the new forms of information make it possible for anybody to have information. But I don't know if it's going to work out that way because it's still one single network. So when you have giant dinosauric structures like that, you have a more and more difficult time to decentralize the power centers, particularly as it takes a lot of centralized energy power, nuclear or fossil fuel, to keep the computer networks running. So unless they can find some clean energy source that is decentralizable, you can plug in and out of without burning down the planet. I don't know if the computer information decentralization can be successful. The other thing, some German philosopher pointed out, is that the very nature of splitting the atom and creation of the bomb is a threat to the planet, but it also implies a constant and continuous future of surveillance state to prevent any anarchist or non-anarchist fascist nut or left-wing nut or middle-class nut from blowing up Paris, London, Tokyo, Berlin, or Oslo, because the absolute nature of the bomb enforces absolute surveillance. So that's a very tricky passage for Democrats, anarchists, fascists. Everybody has got to face this. Scientists have got to face it, and poets have got to face it. How do we resolve that? I don't think anybody has a blueprint. I like the phrase appropriate technology, or sweet science, as Blake calls it, as distinct from dinosauric or monstrous hierarchical technology, or hyper-technology is the word I use.
The spectacular activities of the Antiwar movement and the counterculture in the 60s, do you think this is today a memory in the United States, or has it become an element, a permanent element in society?
Well, I just described the enormous failure of the counterculture anti-war movement in America to control its own anger. Yes, a communal movement protesting peace, witnessing in favor of peace, in which the means justified the ends, i.e. peaceful means for peaceful ends, that would be a great contribution. And I think maybe some aspects of rock and roll do, or be-ins, do in some student movements, as you have now. I think it's a sort of relatively pacifist student movement here in Norway, 1993 fall, have some element of that wisdom. But you need a really clean mind to do that. So to make any great social change on the basis of mass movement, you need a mass movement that didn't depend on anger as its fuel.
Are you optimistic that people, despite all the negative tendencies in society, will be able to?
It's not negative tendencies in society. It's negative tendencies in us, in me, in you. You can't blame it on the outside like that. To what extent do you get angry? To what extent do I get angry? To what extent does any utopian socialist anarchist get angry and trying to enforce his will by force? That's the problem. Or to what extent do businessmen get angry, or anybody, diplomats get angry? My own thought is the same as any old grandmother in Norway, you might ask. Well, it doesn't look too good for the planet. I never saw anything like this before, and it's not likely that the planet will survive another couple hundred years of this human devastation. And maybe the question of hope and fear are irrelevant, in the sense that hope is a good way of sugarcoating the knowledge that we may be in a very bad way. And fear is just a hysterical reaction to the realization that we're in a bad way. Maybe some straightforward, factual clarity and calm and sympathy for the situation might be better than hope. I like sympathy better than hope. It may be that we lose the planet, and I was having a conversation with a Tibetan Lama that I like, Gelek Rinpoche, whom I've been in Europe and America. And I asked him what he thought would happen. He said, well, maybe we have a couple hundred years, and then we lose the planet. And I said, how? And he said, well, not with a bang. No big explosion, just maybe a gridlock, overpopulation and whatnot. So I said, well, what's the purpose of poetry then? If there's no planet, no world to come. He said, same purpose as any human activity, to ease the pain of living, to relieve the mass of human sufferings, to alleviate the enormous suffering that everybody is enduring, just being born and dying to begin with, much less having to worry about the whole planet. That maybe if people have some sense of natural sympathy with themselves and others, they can prolong the life of the planet, or even save it, maybe, though it's not too likely given the devastation we've wrought already, and the fact that we're still dependent on fossil fuel and nuclear energy. But the purpose of any activity, whether it's medicine, television, poetry, parenthood, is to relieve as much suffering as possible. And that's a good compass for young people and older people. It's a good motive for going on and doing lots of work. No hope, no fear, just sympathy.
Last Sunday I wrote down a line from one of your...
Were you there?
Yeah, I was there.
Yeah.
Let the president execute his own desires.
Yeah, let Congress legislate its own delight. Let the president execute his own desire. So I was mocking the Congress as delighting in the war. That was their delight. And the president's war is his own desire. Because it is a subjective, arbitrary choice, as it turned out. The war was not necessary.
So you think there could be a good president if you just could have a president who would also respect his own desires?
No, I don't think, I'm not sure you got the irony in there. I'm saying I declare the end of the war. If the president wants to continue it, let him execute his own desire, which is to continue the war. If the Congress wants to continue funding the war, that's their delight. It's not mine. I'm being ironic about what their delight and desires are. It's more in the line of Blake. I think Clinton certainly is a lot more cheerful than the previous couple presidents, the neoconservatives. or apple-cheeked, and he wasn't afraid to have a marijuana joint in his mouth once. Gore, the vice president, did smoke. And I couldn't imagine Bush having allowed that, though I could imagine Bush sharing some cocaine with Noriega when he was the head of the CIA, paying off Noriega. But I think a lot depends on the tone of things, on the psychological tone. And I think Clinton just has a better feeling of exuberance and sympathy than Bush, who seemed to me basically a bummer and a sourpuss and was depressing everybody. Reagan, ultimately, kind of a sourpuss.
You found Buddhism in Asia, and later you have brought your poetry back to Asia, to China at least.
Yeah.
What kind of effect could your poetry have in the Eastern societies?
Well, it's already had quite a bit of effect, oddly enough. Not my poetry, but the whole realm of Buddhist American beatnik poetry. My Indian journals went out of print, journals that I kept in India, went out of print in 1980 or so, but suddenly were reprinted in India by Viking and have sold very well, much more than in America or England under the English imprint. And I now have a book in China. I think one of the first contemporary American poets who has a whole book. But you know, the contemporary poet heroes, Shu Ting in China, who wrote romantic love poems at a time when it was considered blasphemous from Maoist point of view. Bei Dao, modern intellectual poet. And many of the Shanghai poets were very influential on the student movement in Tiananmen Square. And they were always influenced and interested in what was going on in the American movement from the 50s through the late 60s, and took a certain amount of inspiration there. And I'm told that some verses of mine were written in the board on the walls at Tiananmen Square by the student leaders, and some verses of some statements by Abbie Hoffman, so that that spirit of individualism and libertarian, anarcho-libertarian humor penetrated even through Moscow and China. In Russia, the Cultural Revolution really was what changed the government rather than America's military. It was jeans and rock and roll and modern computers that made a big difference, I think. Brought down the communist bureaucracy, or the Stalinist bureaucracy. And certainly there was a huge influence of not only American poetry, but Bob Dylan, rock and roll, the Beatles, the Soft Machine, the Fugs, Kerouac, Burroughs, on the Charter 77 and the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia. And I think that's been the most interesting model.
So now they maybe need a strategy to bring this attitude to young people in the Islamic countries.
Yes, that wouldn't be the ideal. The very interesting thing is it's the difference between a non-theistic and a very heavily theistic metaphysics. It's a metaphysical question in a sense, question of the origin of things. Some Buddhist teachers have said the real Armageddon, the ultimate battle, will be the spiritual war between the theists and the non-theists, which may mean that he said that the capitalist communist fight is nothing compared to what's going to go on between those who insist that everybody believe their God and those who feel that God is an ideological imposition on the mind or putting a roof on the mind.
But even in the taste, since you have a tradition of the mystics, the Sufis, people who broke out politicized religious system.
Yeah, well, and Taoism is not non-theistic. Confucianism is non-theistic. Buddhism is non-theistic. Ultimately, Hinduism should be, if it isn't, at the moment, fanatical Hindus are burning down Muslim temples. for political advantage, but usually it's politicians getting a hold of that religious impulse and trying to exploit it for demagogic power means. As basically that's all the Ayatollahs did. I mean, his whole jihad against Salman Rushdie was basically a political ploy to use that as a symbol of Western intervention and fight it ideologically by imitating Burroughs' Hassani Sabah and sending out assassins to get the enemies of his power, the Ayatollah's power or the inheritors of his power. It's tough, though, because all over the world, in the United States, in Germany, everywhere, there is this theo-political, fundraising, televangelistic, power-hungry demagogue tendency. Whether it's the head of Serbia, fighting for nationalistic and Orthodox Serbian ideals against Muslim multicultural tolerance, or Catholicism in New York, trying to persecute fairies and homosexuals, particularly on the Irish St. Patrick's Day parade, even after Ireland has legalized homosexuality, beginning with the age of 16, or the theopolitical fundamentalist television evangelists in America raising money to insist on censorship on television and in schools, and insist on teaching that the earth was created in 404 BC according to the Bible, and even some of them saying that we should kill all fairies and homosexuals because it says so in the Bible. So there's a whole very strong group, and they were allied with Reagan and with Bush, so they were a power group. And they've affected television. Like my poetry, it can't be recited on American television anymore until 8 p.m. at night. There's new rules, new censorship. So there's a powerful group even in America. And then in Germany you have similar nationalisms and theocratic morale. So you as well as the Islamic world. And then you have equivalent nationalistic, ideological absolutism in China, with its campaign against spiritual corruption, namely rock and roll and Western poetry and whatnot. When I was in China, I found that the Chinese students that I lectured to were eager to learn about meditation. So I gave a little, usually as a footnote to Gary Snyder's poetry, I gave a little instruction in meditation practice, just as I did here. So then we practiced maybe 5 minutes of sitting, and then I read them Gary Snyder's and Philip Whalam's poetry, and they understood from the inside what was going on, I think.
You might soon be on MTV with U2 or Sonic Youth, I understand.
Well, it depends how it works.
I
was in Dublin, and Bono came to, of U2 came to my poetry reading there, with quite a large audience. And then he asked me a few days later if I'd come into his U2 television studio to record 2 poems, Whom Bomb and Don't Smoke. And he led me in time so that they could sync it with one of their songs for a 3-channel blockbuster TV production that they're going to put on in a couple months in America and Europe. But I don't know if they'll use it.
Do you see even the commercial youth culture represented by MTV, McDonald's, Coca-Cola, Nike as a way of telling young people all over the world to insist on enjoying life and turning their backs to the fundamentalists?
Well, I think anything that will sell McDonald's hamburgers, which I think is ecologically destructive to begin with, so you've got an immediate problem there. They were, as far as I understand them, they rely on the meat culture, which I think is a disaster. It's an agronomic disaster, it's an ecological disaster, and it's a dietary disaster, the whole meat thing, the whole meat consumption culture. So I don't know how, Gregory Corso says, no good news can be written on bad news. Talking about the newspapers, you have to cut down a forest to print the New York Times. So he said, no good news can be written on bad news. Yes and no. Certainly the bands themselves are liberated intellectuals who know what they're doing, like Sonic Youth, and are very intelligent in trying to deal with the system directly and trying to infiltrate or even dominate or even enforce their own inspiration. But in order to get through, you really do have to have the economic power either to own a station of your own or to work with somebody that's powerful enough, like Ben and Jerry's, the ice cream people, to who are liberal and open and ecologically aware, to subsidize your activities. I think you too are big enough so they can subsidize their own activities. I think that's what Dylan wanted to do. That's what the Beatles wanted to do originally. Build up enough money so that they could own their own distribution and their own capital system, rather than being dependent on the big corporate world and other corporate world. But how good news can be written on bad news, I don't know. Why I meditate, which is to say, sitting practice of meditation. Why I meditate. I sit because the Dadaists screamed on Mirror Street, Spiegelgasse. I sit because the Surrealists. I sit because the Surrealists ate angry pillows. I sit because the Imagists, William Carlos Williams and Charles Resnikoff, poets, breathed calmly in Rutherford and Manhattan. I sit because 2,400 years. I sit in America because Buddha saw a corpse in Lumbini. I sit because, no because. I sit because the yippies whooped up Chicago skies once. I sit because I was unable to trace the unborn back to its womb. I sit because it's easy. I sit because I get angry if I don't. I sit because they told me to. I sit because I read about it in the funny papers. I sit because I had a vision, also dropped LSD. I sit because I don't know what else to do, like my friend poet Peter Orlovsky. I sit because after Lunacharsky got fired and Stalin gave Zhdanov a special tennis court, I became a ruthless cosmopolitan. I sit inside the shell of the old me for world revolution. I'll sing a song. Do the meditation rock. If you want to learn how to meditate, I'll tell you now, 'cause it's never too late. I'll tell you how, 'cause I can't wait. It's just that great that it's never too late. If you are an old fraud like me or a llama who lives in eternity, the first thing you do when you meditate is keep your spine, your backbone straight. Sit yourself down on a pillow on the ground or sit in a chair if the ground isn't there. If the ground isn't there, if the ground isn't there, sit where you are if the ground isn't there. Follow your breath out, open your eyes, and sit there steady and sit there wise. Follow your breath right out of your nose. Follow it out as far as it goes. Follow your breath, but don't hang on to the thought of your death in old Saigon. Follow your breath when thought forms rise. Whatever you think, it's a big surprise. It's a big surprise. It's a big surprise. Whatever you think, it's a big surprise. Do the meditation. Do the meditation. Do the meditation. Do the meditation. Learn a little patience and generosity. Boom, boom, boom. All you got to do is to imitate. You're sitting meditating and you're never too late. When thoughts catch up but your breath goes on, forget what you thought about Uncle Don. If you see a vision come, say hello, goodbye. Play it dumb with an empty eye. If you want a holocaust, you can recall your mind. It just went past with the western wind. And if you see apocalypse in a long red car or a flying saucer, sit where you are. Feel a little bliss, don't worry about that. Give your wife a kiss when your tire goes flat. If you can't think straight, you don't know who to call, it's never too late to do nothing at all. Do nothing at all. Do nothing at all. It's never too late to do nothing at all. Do the meditation. Follow your breath so your body and your mind get together. Get together for a rest. Get together for a rest. Get together for a rest. Relax your mind. Get together for a rest. Do the meditation. Follow your breath so your body and your mind get together for a rest. Get together for a rest. Get together for a rest. Relax your mind. Get together for a rest. If you sit for an hour or a minute every day, you can tell the superpower to sit the same way. Tell the superpower to watch and to wait and to stop and meditate, cause it's never too late. No, it's never too late. It's never too late to tell the superpower to stop and meditate. No, never too late. It's never too late to tell the superpower to stop and meditate. Do the meditation, do the meditation, do the meditation, do the meditation. Get yourself together, lots of energy and generosity, 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 yeah, generosity.